Hello everyone, my name is Bisma Pervaiz and it is a privilege to speak to you at API Specifications Conference 2022. The topic of my talk today is taking generated code beyond Hello World. And before we jump into talking about what this talk holds for you, let me just take a moment to briefly introduce myself. I am a software engineer by profession and I have been working at APIMatic for quite some time now. So let's begin with talking about how important and how common it is nowadays for API providers to generate SDKs and code samples. The only problem with those generated SDKs is that they are not ready to be used in production level applications. Why? Because they are just merely a translation of that API specification into code. And why is that so? Because that API specification is not built for this purpose. And if you are generating code from it and you want to use that code in a production level code, you would have to add certain elements and layers on top of that SDK, that code that is being generated. And my talk today is exactly about what those elements and layers can be. So let's begin. My agenda for the talk today will be to answer this question firstly, what's your end goal with an API? We will see how code samples help in smooth integration of an API in a production level code. We will see how great SDKs and good quality code samples help you in quick API integration. And then we will also see the difference between an API wrapper and an SDK when we add different layers on top of that API wrapper. So let's start with answering this question, that what's your end goal with an API? So if you are an API provider and you want developers to use your API in their production level code, what will you do? What are you doing to create ease for them? So let's just take a step back and see what an API consumer goes through when they're trying to use your API in their production level code. So for this purpose, I recorded a small video where I was trying to use an online API endpoint and I wanted to create meetings. So I navigated to its create meeting endpoint. And then I was scrolling down when I suddenly saw code samples on the right hand side of the screen. And I was so excited to see these code samples because they were available in multiple languages and in my preferred language as well, C#. So I started skimming through this code. There was a HTTP client, okay, and I saw that they were sending a authorization header. So I could tell that they were respecting that. Then I saw that they were sending the data with the request as well. And here I'm just scrolling through that data that was being sent. And then I scrolled down and I saw they were actually making the request, getting the response and just printing it. So what I did was that I copied this code sample and I pasted it in front of you on the slide. So now my question to you is that would you use this code sample in your production level application or not? And before you answer it, let me just take a few moments to skim through this code for anyone who does not understand C#. Please feel free to go and look up for this API in your preferred language. So here in the first line, we are actually creating a HTTP client, and then we are actually initializing a request object where we are setting the HTTP method as post. Then we are setting the URL for the endpoint that we will be hitting. We are sending the authorization information in headers. We are sending the data as a JSON string, okay, and then we are setting the content type as JSON, and then in line number 18 we are just making the call, and in lines following that we are validating that response and then just printing it out on console. Okay, so before you tell me what you decided, let me just pinpoint a few things that I noticed instantly when I saw this code sample. So first of all, I noticed some bad HTTP practices here. So the first thing is that they are initializing a new HTTP client for every endpoint. So imagine using 5 or 6 endpoints from this API, and you would have 5 or 6 HTTP client instances. Whoa, I would never want so many HTTP client instances in my application. Secondly, I saw a security vulnerability. So we are sending in a very sensitive set of information such as authorization in a header, and I would never recommend that to anyone, and I will never do that myself. So by this time, I was already doubting my decision for using this code sample in my production level application. But I still skimmed through this code and I saw that they were sending the data as a hard coded JSON string. This was very disturbing for me because even if you're not a C# pro, you know that this is not the right way to send data with a request. You have to create classes, you create objects of those classes and let those objects project the data you want to send. You then use any JSON serializer of your language, of your preferred language, and then you send that serialized object with the request, right? So this was the time I completely gave up and I said I won't be using this code sample. But when I looked at this code sample as a whole, I found other refactoring opportunities as well, and I thought I might share those with you. So first of all, imagine that I have to use 5 or 6 endpoints from this API. So that would mean I would have a lot of code duplication and repetition in my application. So apart from the problems we just discussed in previous slides, uh, if you see the request URI, you can easily extract the base URL from it and just give it the endpoints route with that base URL. Then definitely I won't send the header, the authorization information in headers. I won't send data like this. I will create classes and objects and then serialize that object and then send. Since I know that my data is always in JSON form, so I will take this logic out of setting the content type as JSON every time I'm calling an endpoint and take it somewhere else. Then I see that I'm always handling my response in a certain way. So I would even take out this logic and do this somewhere else. So why do I keep repeating and saying extract this logic and do this somewhere else? Because you can actually create a library for this and then use that library to just make the endpoint call and handle all that. Library will handle all of this for you and you will just get the response, right? So all the duplicated and code repetitions will go into that library for once and you don't have to handle them again and again. So by now, I was pretty sure that I was not going to use this code sample because this was not copy ready. And as a developer myself, I love copy ready code samples because all I have to do is just copy it in my application and then just work on top of it. But this was not the case here. So since I was critically analyzing this code sample so much and this sort of API integration so much, I only thought that it would be fair that I find something to show you what sort of API integration will I be using. So I did a bit of a research and I found this API, Square's API, and I instantly saw that they were giving out SDKs with their API. So they are advising you to use their SDK to call their endpoints. So all you have to do now is initialize a client of their SDK and then just call that endpoint from that client. So now you will do client dot that endpoint that you want to use. It is just as simple as that. And I was so excited to look at this solution that they were providing, because that is exactly what we were discussing in our previous slides, where we were talking about either creating a library ourselves or using a third-party library to handle all the duplication and all the code that we were repeating for an endpoint. So with this, we are very clear that for a faster, smoother, and much efficient API integration for developers, we need SDKs. And we need SDKs because with great SDKs, we get awesome code samples. And with awesome code samples, our API integration becomes very quick, because it's just a matter of copy pasting those code samples in your application. So now we know that we use SDKs because they're faster, because they're easier to use, and because they enhance the performance of your application. So they're faster because you're already getting the API wrapping code and you just have to build on top of it. It is easier to use because you just have to copy paste those code samples and use them. And it enhances the performance of your application by providing for an optimized and lightweight code base. So just imagine writing all that code for that API usage yourself. And in that case, you're prone to make those mistakes we just saw in these previous slides. So if you want good performance, you will have to use good quality SDKs that will provide for a lightweight base for your application. So now we are very clear that if you have an API and you want your developers to use your API in their production level coding, you will have to provide them with SDK. But there is still a long way to discuss that what sort of what sort of SDKs would you provide your developers with. So at APIMatic, the first layer that we provide on top of our API specification is the API specification wrapping layer. So this is exactly the translation of your API specification into a generated code. So what do you get at this point as an SDK? That you will get data models, you will get endpoints, you will get authentication, you will even get HTTP request building, and you can even call the endpoints. But if you ask me that, is this SDK ready to be used in a production level application? I would say no. And I give a very simple example for this. What if your calls start failing? What are you going to do then? You will have to write more code on top of it, right? So to handle things like these, we need to add more elements on top of it. So at this point, if I ask you, can you do more? You should definitely answer yes, because there is room for more. So at APIMatic, what we do next is we add a consumer developer experience layer. And that layer actually includes everything that was lacking in the last layer we just discussed. So what if your calls are failing? You can, with this layer, you can now retry with exponential backoff. What if you want to configure the client yourself? You can do that with this layer. You have configurable loggers, you have extendable interfaces, you have optimized error messages, you can make concurrent multiple API calls with thread safe calls. And the best part that I like about this layer is that we get guides with code samples. So so just imagine the SDK as with the first layer, and now imagine the SDK with this layer. So this SDK with the consumer developer experience layer is more equipped to be a part of the production level code, right? So so now I ask you, do you think this is enough? Now that we have catered for the needs of our consumer developers, do you think this is enough? Because at APIMatic, we did not think this was enough. So we added another layer which catered for the need of our developers at the provider end. So whoever is providing this SDK, they would need to monitor that SDK. They would need to maintain the versions of that the SDK that they are providing. They would need unit tests, CI/CD pipeline, and with all these things, if they want to analyze these things, they would need telemetry. So with this third layer intact, they the provider developer experience enhances a lot. So by now we have enhanced the experience of our developers at the provider end and at the consumer end. But this is still not it, and we added another layer on top of it that I like to call the cherry on top, because with this layer, which is the language layer, we are providing our SDKs in multiple languages. And every SDK that we provide in one language is different from the SDK that is being offered in another language, because we are taking care of the language conventions and language semantics. And that's what makes our SDKs stand out, because the developers in every language can use that SDK according to their own language semantics and conventions. So with these 4 layers, your SDK is now ready as an experience for your consumers and your provider developers. And you can now give this SDK to your consumers to be used in a production level coding application. So I would like to end my talk with a very famous quote from Nelson Mandela, where he says that if you talk to a man in a language he understands, it goes to his head. But if you talk to him in a language, in his language, it goes to his heart. So I think it's time that we start speaking the language of our developers and hit that spot in their heart. And we are very glad that at APIMatic we are hitting that spot of developers at consumer end and the provider end as well. So thank you so much for sticking around and listening to this talk. And I would really appreciate that if you have any questions, you can ask them at Open API Initiative Slack workspace, just as mentioned on the ASC 2022 website. Thank you so much once again, and have a nice day.